So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm particularly thankful to Professor Angus Morrison Sánchez, who made the connections for making my stay in WA possible this time. It's the sixth time I come here, so I'm pleased to come back. And also to Professor Jenny Hope for introducing me to the CRC time team. And well, I'm pleased to present. Thank you. On to some extent new developments, but also old issues related to the mining industry. So the title of the presentation is Mining Closure Planning Must Face the Challenge of a Nature Positive Future. So nature positive is kind of new buzzword, but it's also at the same time something that has been around with different names for some time. So I try to develop this thinking about the connections between mine closure planning and the new demands for nature positive outcomes from mining. So I come from the University of São Paulo. There I'm part of the staff of the engineering school, which is called Polytechnica, and I'm with the Department of Mining and Petroleum Engineering. And part of what I'm going to present results from research undertook by my current and former students. And I need to acknowledge that because it's by discussing and writing with young students that we really advance our understanding and try to face new challenges. The idea of the presentation is in 4 parts to explain why are nature positive outcomes needed, what would be the implications for life of mine planning with an eye on mine closure, of course, and we spent some time discussing about the biodiversity offsets because it's not the same thing as nature positive outcomes, but there is a connection between what has been doing and the experience gained by many companies worldwide implementing biodiversity offsets and what could be understood as the new requirements for nature positive outcomes. And then at the very end, some conclusions in the summary of my presentation. So why do we need and why are we talking about nature positive? One of the main reasons is the steep decline in biodiversity. So this is a figure that has been reproduced and readapted in several publications. It shows the decline of nature over time. The trend, if you don't do anything or any reasonable approach, and possible recovery if we have more ambitious goals that can be labeled nature positive. On the right-hand side of the figure, this is, comes from a 2009 paper, well quoted by Rockström and collaborators. They updated that recently, but already in 2009, they showed that yes, what should they do?
I might.
No, Guy, you just had a message saying people have the audio, they can hear it.
Yeah, they can.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay, tell me if send the other. So I'm talking about planetary boundaries. So the brightest of the worst one in 2009 was considered by those authors as being biodiversity, and we are certainly in a worse, no better situation today. In the World Economic Forum, the annual meeting in Switzerland, they have been surveying what are considered the top risks for business and biodiversity. Unfortunately, it has been ranking high in recent surveys, including the last one I will comment soon. One of the actions that has been tried and proposed is the so-called 30 by 30 targets that comes from the Convention on Biological Diversity, the last conference on parties that started in China and was interrupted by COVID and finished up in Montreal, Canada, where the Secretariat of the Convention is based, established in the last meeting, last conference of parties, this so-called 30 by 30 target. And basically that means they have several targets, but target 2 and target 3 are directly related to the idea of 30 by 30. So 2030 is a target to have at least 30% of areas of degraded terrestrial, inland water, coastal and marine ecosystems under effective restoration. It's important the adjective, not only restoration, there could be several levels of restoration. or rehabilitation in order to enhance biodiversity and ecosystem function and service. So they're not only talking about protecting, but also enhancing. It's an important concept here. And target 3 talks about ensuring and enabling that already by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial inland water and coastal marine areas, especially of areas of importance for biodiversity and ecosystem functional services, are effectively conserved and managed. So these are very ambitious targets. It's highly uncertain if we collectively will be able to reach them, but it's important to have them as a reference and as a framework because that calls several groups for action, in particular governments and businesses. So maybe some of you have followed. Only last week there were news that in England they have approved new legislation calling for new developments, any kind of development, to deliver more and better natural habitats than before intervention, than before project. They are no longer talking all about offsetting or no net loss. I'll comment on that soon, but on going one step ahead and they establish a target, a minimum target of 8% that can be raised in the future maybe. Also, business have been called to action. So, for example, the World Economic Forum again proposed 5 ways that business can do to implement the new global biodiversity framework. The GBF is the result, the final document of this Conference of Parties of Montreal, the Convention on Biological Diversity. One business consultant has been surveying how companies are managing their biodiversity footprint, finding that they are starting to move, but on a very narrow base so far, especially if compared with action that has been taken or at least announced in terms of climate change. And in particular for mining activity, and again, the World Economic Forum is a reference place. ICMM announced in January this year that they are making a commitment towards a nature positive future. So leading global mining and metals companies have today, 17th of January, committed to take urgent action to support a nature positive future for 2030. I will explain what they understand for and the actions they propose for a nature positive future. But it's important to notice that that was announced at the World Economic Forum, and they released it at the last Global Risk Report. And there's an interesting part about biodiversity that I described here. So they consult and they survey business leaders. And they say the respondents disagree about the urgency of environmental risk, in particular biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, and critical change to our systems. So interesting, I found this a very interesting finding. Younger respondents tend to rank these risks far more highly over the 2-year period because they inquire about the short-term risks and long-term risks, and they consider that as a 2-year period and 10-year period. With both risks featuring in their top 10 rankings in the short term. The private sector highlights these risks as top concerns, but over the long term. In contrast to respondents from civil society or government who prioritize these risks over shorter time frames. So it seems that business in general, and of course mining in particular, need to act quickly in terms of having better response to the biodiversity crisis and challenges. So ICMM proposed 5 commitments. That's from their website. I will comment on number 2 and number 4 because they are more related to the issue of life of mine planning and mine closure in particular. But before that, let's take a look at the concept of nature positive. There is a coalition of NGOs, some companies and business organizations called the Nature Positive Initiative. And they have been advancing the idea of a nature positive that they understand as halting and reversing biodiversity loss through measurable gains in health, abundance, diversity, and resilience, of species, ecosystems, and nature process. So there are two basic components of any nature positive initiative: to halt loss and to reverse past losses. There's also an important paper, more than one, but I highlight here one by IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They define nature positive, as you can see here, a global and societal goal to halt and reverse the loss of nature across all four realms. And that's the figure taken from that publication: water, biodiversity, air, climate, and soil. And of course, they are interconnected. And the idea of nature positive encompass actions across the four realms, as they call them. And important also to know that they understand that halt and reversing means it's about avoiding and minimizing impacts, and in addition, restoring and regenerating nature. That's what we, in several fields, but in particular in environmental and social impact assessment, call the mitigation hierarchy. That's the priority that we should keep when we design and plan for new projects. First, to make all our efforts to avoid that worst impacts, then to reduce or minimize them, and finally, restoring what will be lost, and as a last resort, offsetting or compensating for what cannot be sufficiently restored or minimized. So the mitigation hierarchy is a key concept also when we talk mitigation hierarchy. So second part, what does that could mean for mining, and for mining planning, and for planning for mine closure. Here I suggest that along recent years, we can have and have been developing different goals for developing and assessing mining projects, but that could be considered as a more general approach to other kinds of development. By undertaking environmental impact assessment, we essentially seek to minimize losses. We have been talking the last maybe 20 years at least, or even more, about counterbalancing unavoidable losses with equivalent gains that we call offsetting or seeking net low net loss. And now the challenge, not exactly from 2024, but in the more recent periods, the challenge has been to generate net positive impact along all, I would say, all sectors or components. When we talk about minimizing losses, sometimes we accept losing, for example, biodiversity in exchange of jobs or economic development. And now when we talk nature positive, we are seeking gains, actual absolute gains in nature in general, and biodiversity in particular. So we have more ambitious goals that I think is conversant with the idea of mining industry of seeking positive legacies during the life of a mine and after a mine closes. And as I had mentioned before, it requires first the application, rigorous application of the mitigation hierarchy, but possibly something beyond that. And that includes mine closure planning that is convergent with the idea of seeking nature positive outcomes. Some aspects that are important when we are talking about mining projects. We probably all know of the frequent overlap of mineral deposits and areas that are considered to be important for biodiversity, like critical habitats, hosting endangered species, and so on. In that context, the possibilities of avoiding and minimizing harmful impacts are often limited. That means that the decision sometimes is to proceed or simply not to proceed because the impacts would be judged to be unacceptable. An important part of the mining business is rehabilitation. Sometimes the purpose of rehabilitation is the so-called ecological restoration. When we seek for ecological restoration, many times we find some practical difficulties in restoring some types of biodiversity values. And there's also the issue of the time gap. If you start storing 10, 20, or 30 years after you start mining, that means you have a period of time where you have a net loss of biodiversity. And also not less important, considering the long time frame, sometimes in mining companies, you have changes in ownership, changes in management that can interfere with agreements or targets established by the previous managers or owners, and that can have an influence on the legacies. So a number of challenges for mining companies to go nature positive. One of them is to acknowledge that there are some areas that would be exempted from mineral development, that even in existing or future mines, there could be sectors of the mineral deposits that cannot be developed in order to protect the whole part of the nature positive initiative. Not be developed, but not further recovered. There's the issue of time lag, which sometimes prompts or have the idea or some practical actions of anticipating this seeking for gains, like anticipating for offsetting or for conserving areas of biological importance for a future development elsewhere. The issue of gaining social acceptance or social license for the undertaking nature conservation and actions. Sometimes there could be a difference with the local communities in that aspect, like impeding access to areas traditionally used by the communities, or restricting at least. And the issue of, we work with, for example, protecting nature, restoring parts of the ecosystem that have been destroyed in the past by others, by those parties, but how do we ensure the long-term, the permanence of those gains? That's important considering the long time frame of mining developments and changes in usual frequent changes in ownership and management. When we consider mine closure, I'm sure many of you know a little bit the history of the sequence. In the past, mines were simply abandoned. Then we start thinking about rehabilitation, but only after we had started mining. Then we, of course, understood that we need to plan for rehabilitate as soon as possible when we develop a new project and implement progressive rehabilitation as much as possible in every mine site. And then we, of course, talked about we have a new mine, we need to plan for the closure of that mine, even if we still didn't open that mine. But also we started talking about planning for post-closure, what to do with that land, with that area, maybe 20 or 80 years in the future when mining is over. So we are more or less hopefully in the two last, we could say, stages of thinking about mine closure planning, but we still see around the world companies that are operating in the first levels. And unfortunately, we have a big challenge that is, we have a very nice and very good mine closure plan, but someone else will implement it. Someone else will take care of all our commitments with the communities, governments, and other stakeholders. So that's something to be taken into account and to have or to find a solution. So let's finally go to the ICMM commitments. One of them, number 4, is to restore and enhance landscapes around operations. So they, of course, talk about mine sites, so we'll talk about that later, but they also look more broadly at the region, the area where the mine operates, which is, of course, is fine, it's important. So they call for restore and enhance landscape around operations, and to that, they say we need local partnerships, including with indigenous people, with land-connected peoples, and with local communities. It's important to note and understand that mining can affect biodiversity to different pathways and not only through direct land clearing. I will show a picture soon or a figure soon. Biodiversity can be affected beyond and sometimes well beyond the mine footprint. The impacts on biodiversity can persist after mine closure. I think it's really included that, but the landscape approach is necessary to plan for offsetting residual impacts on biodiversity and partnering with land people and indigenous peoples is essential, especially in some parts of the world. Let's take a look at those characteristics in a little detail. I will not go into detail in this figure, it's called impact pathways, but basically the idea is to show that mining can cause direct impacts on biodiversity and indirect impacts on biodiversity, for example, by stimulating other economic activities in the region or by facilitating access to land and other activities, some of them legal, others could be illegal. And these are some of the ways that mining can affect biodiversity, in addition to the well-known clearing land for mining infrastructure. So we lose habitat. We can also fragment habitat. So these are well-known, well-understood impacts. And they tend to be considered impact assessments, for example. But if we start thinking about nature positive, we need to have a broader picture of all possible impacts a mine can have on biodiversity. Effects can be felt beyond the mine footprint. So I take this figure from these authors. They specifically look at the mining in forest environments, especially in tropical forests that have been studied in different parts of the world, like Indonesia, Brazil, Amazon in general. And they separate impacts in the mine they call mining area, on-site impacts, these direct forest loss, but also indirect forest loss. So that's really to remember us that if you are talking about nature positive mining and having in mind how we become planning for mine closure and post closure, which type of impacts we will consider in our nature positive plan. I think this kind of document does not exist, but maybe it comes to existence sometime soon. Also, we need to consider the mine itself, but also its associated facilities. In some jurisdictions, approval, like impact assessment for those components of a mining project, are assessed separately. That's the case in Brazil. And this is one example of one iron mine project that has been impeded, not because they found that the impacts on the mine side were unacceptable, but they had planned to build an ore pipeline and a maritime terminal. And the place they chose for the maritime terminal was considered to be the only breeding place in the whole coast of Brazil of this type of endangered turtle. And apparently the company was not willing to consider locational alternatives, and the project did not go ahead. So we need to think of all for example, the IFC performance standards, so that associate facilities. Sometimes they are undertook by another company, by a different developer, but they are part of the project, or the project cannot locally be implemented and operate without those associated facilities. So the impacts of the whole set of developments need to be considered. Induced impacts, that means impacts that are have assorted actions of others, of third parties, but are facilitated because you have a mine, especially most often because you have infrastructure to serve the mine, and many times that infrastructure is built because there will be new mining project, normally large projects. And we observe this effect in different parts of the tropical forest of the tropical world. This example comes from a study that was made simulating the possible forest loss both direct on the left-hand side and indirect. You see that the scale is different, not the same scale. On the basis of past land use changes or transitions in that very same region. This is in the northwestern part of the Brazilian Amazon. We also, in this case, the shaded part of the bars show the overlap of possible or simulated deforestation of forest loss to overlapping areas considered to be particularly important for biodiversity. The idea also that should be considered that the impacts of mining on biodiversity can persist after mine closure, especially if you rely on restoration, be it of the mine site restoration or off-site restoration. Many companies are already investing in doing interesting works in exploring at the landscape level with partnerships with local communities, but it also takes time. We need to consider, otherwise we will have a loss in a short, it's short, but in a certain period of time. The idea of landscape approach to reach nature positive outcomes. This is, we can find that in the literature. Many authors call attention to this need. It's say received and considered by the ICMM commitments with nature positive. What could that mean in terms of planning, mine development, and planning for mine closure? First, that means that we need to look beyond the mine site. I think that's clear enough. And we could work at the landscape level, either by improving or getting most from our offsetting strategy and our offset actions. I will show an example right now or soon, but also from so-called additional conservation actions. That's wording and the terminology associated with biodiversity offsets literature. Those are considered to be additional actions, such as those that are shown here, but not limited to those, that do not necessarily or are not directly linked to the losses that are resulting from the project, but that could improve biodiversity conditions in the area or more generally in the landscape. What's that? That's about the idea of working at the landscape scale. This was resulting from a study in an area of an iron ore mine. The mine is located in this, well, that's in the center of this image. Around here, the gray shades would represent areas that are affected or directly affected by the mine. This is not a land cover map. This is a cover of landscape connectivity. Particular type of landscape matrix was used here. It's called probability of connectivity index. It shows how likely it is for certain species of fauna to move around the landscape. So in this map around the mine site, the map was made in 3 connectivity classes. Low, intermediate, and high, respectively red, yellow, and green. This figure shows the situation at the beginning of the mining construction. The mine was not operating there, but they were already working on planning and starting implementing offsets. And then we made a projection of the future or likely future situation in case we consider the offsets to be, let's say, successful or meet their objectives. And you see that you will have more green in the landscape, hope to have more green in the landscape in the future, we projected for 30 years, than in the moment that preceded or in the moment when the mine was being built or connected. That's to show an example of thinking in terms of the landscape. And this also connects mine planning from the preparation of environmental impact assessment, from the preparation of offset plans to the closure plan. So if you want to have this positive legacy in the landscape in the future or in the long term, you need to work to guarantee that the gains will be lasting. And the point of partnering with local communities, indigenous peoples when they are present in the landscape, or other types of land-connected people. In Brazil, for example, mining is not legally permitted in indigenous lands. We have lots of small-scale, sometimes not so small, wildcat mining, especially for gold, but we don't have any large mine inside the land, but indigenous lands. But we do have many projects that overlap or are in the proximity of the areas occupied by other communities, like Bruns or Afro-descendants, or other communities that could be considered as being connected or closely connected to the land. And so the participation of involvement and engagement of those communities is essential for the whole of mine, the life of mine planning. And I'll show later an example of mine overlapping such an area where research was conducted trying to get the meaning of land rehabilitation in that particular area, considering the perspectives of the local community. Well, more comments on ICMM commitments. So number 4, how to biodiversity laws at our operations achieve at least no net loss of biodiversity. So that's well established, and it's important that it's reflected here at all mine sites by closure against a 2020 baseline. A few comments on that. First is the baseline. Probably they adopted this 2020 baseline because in other international commitments like the Nature Positive Initiative, they set the 2020 baseline to get to as a reference to get gains or absolute gains by 2030, the idea of 2030 target. In other mining projects, we should probably go much back to the past. That achieving no net loss often in mine means you need to offset, so you need to plan adequately for offsetting. That achieving no net loss may require anticipation of conservation measures, as I had commented earlier. And if you look at mine sites, of course, you need to restore mine sites, you need to work as the best possible actions in the site that have been disturbed by mine. But if you consider that pathway, those pathways of mining affecting biodiversity, it's probably not enough to restore the mine sites. Let's take a look at some of those. These figures represent the time lag. If you look only at the mine site, and if you are doing only mine site restoration. So at the moment when the project starts, you clear the land, so you lose biodiversity values. For a number of years, you are in that situation, and then you start rehabilitating. If your rehabilitation goal is ecological restoration, you start to have biodiversity gains. And ideally, sometime in the future, could be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, depending on how difficult it is and the particularities of your mine site, you would, let's say, theoretically achieve the same level of the same value of biodiversity as you had before the mine had been developed. Of course, you can also conceptualize that at the beginning you had a very poor biodiversity baseline, and at the very end you are in a better situation. But let's consider this equal gain or equal aim for this activity of site rehabilitation. Well, in all that period, you have some loss. And that means that it's not possible to consider no net loss in a mine site if you rely only on the mine site restoration. Also, it's important to note that the concept of no net loss Yes, please. Wow, I need to speed up. Thank you. The concept of no net loss is normally a point or a moment in a trajectory of biodiversity recovery. And once you go beyond that point, you'd be somewhere in net gains. For achieving net gains, you may need what are called as additional conservation actions, and these are some of the types of additional conservation actions that you use. Well, this looks like a very complicated figure, but the idea at the very end is simple. Didn't change. My screen is different from the screen. Block it. Yeah, it's frozen there. That was the previous slide I had.
Yes.
We close and start again. Exactly offsets, but very quickly because of the time, and I know many of you may have other commitments right now. So why are I'm talking about learnings, lessons from implementing biodiversity offsets? Because if you can demonstrate no net loss, we are following in the way towards nature positive outcomes. And this is basically what we learned from studying those projects about how we should consider offsets in mining projects. First, through application of the mitigation hierarchy, representing that this part of the figure. So through adherence to mitigation hierarchy, considering the limits to what can be offset, not everything cannot mine everywhere, and saying we are going to offset. That's considered to be a misuse of the offset concept. And then we need to plan following three main criteria, and explain a little bit, that are equivalence, additionality, and permanence. These, of course, come from several sources in the literature. Specifically, so when you plan for offsets and you take those guiding principles of equivalence, additionality, and permanence, you have a set of potential compensation areas, and you first apply the idea of equivalence. Is the area that I'm going to restore and or protect, or combination of both, equivalent to what we lost. So you have ideally a set of areas that are considered equivalent. Then we are going to plan to restore at different spots in the landscape and to protect areas that could be lost by other developments if we didn't protect them. And you have different conceptual and methodological approaches to study those areas. And lately, and that's, I will highlight this because it doesn't mind closure planning, this is particularly important. How can we guarantee the long-standing or permanence of those offsets? This is exactly the case study I was mentioning too. So the company was required legally to compensate for a number of interventions, not only vegetation clearing, but especially. The company in that case had a commitment to go beyond legislation and reach net positive impacts of biodiversity. So our study was about understanding how offsets were planning and if they met the criteria. Very briefly, that's the area balance. It's important to know that here we have two main types of ecosystems, forests and grasslands. They are very different and also different importance in terms of biodiversity. Grasslands are highly important because they have high endemism. So that's very quickly the area balance that they came up at the end of that stage in the project. It's also important to say that often in mining, you have the dynamic situations. You are mining expanding and clear new areas, and you need to plan for offsetting with a long-term perspective. An example of actions that are
too. So this is a whole property that was considered and bought for restoration, and they need to implement both restoration and the protection in the same area. So you don't have a piece of land. This is to be protected. This is to be restored. It's a mosaic. It's a combination of areas. In this detail, we show, for example, that in one particular group of property here at sea, you have areas that will be with remaining vegetation that will be protected and others that will be restored. That's the question. So about the permanence. So we look at those offsets, asking 4 questions. What's the level of legal protection? How do they deal with risk management, adaptive monitoring management, and which are the financial guarantees? So you need to ensure and use the local legal system to build guarantees that your offsets will last for a long period of time, particularly after the mine closes. You also have appropriate risk management to face the threats to the integrity of those offsets. Could be fire, could be climate change, could be invasion, could be invasive species, whatever. So the company needs to have a plan for that, but what needs to be noticed is that most of the time the company will implement that plan while it is actively in the region or working in the site. What happens afterwards? And what happens afterwards is mostly linked to having proper financial guarantees and governance structure to ensure that the offsets will remain after the mine closure. That means that the mine closure plan needs to have special programs and maybe funding for taking care of those offset areas. In that particular case, one version of their closure plan didn't have those closures, but they told us that they updated that to consider guarantees for long-term maintenance of those areas. Well, I skipped this because of the time. I'll briefly comment on what could be a nature positive post-mine land. Once you have in mind local populations, as I had a comment on the previous question. So one approach, among others, that could be useful this is to look at restoration. And we applied this to the mine site, but could be applied to the landscape more generally under the concept, under the lens of ecosystem services. And we ask questions such as this: those mine rehabilitation also restore ecosystem services to a level that is acceptable or appropriate to the local communities, and how to consider this when we evaluate restoration outcomes, instead of using only biodiversity indicators like plant growth or other indicators that are commonly considered. We applied this idea that we call ecosystem service assessment for rehabilitation, built on guidelines existing for considering ecosystem services in environmental impact assessment. These are consistent with IFC's performance standards, the set of performance standards. We use that as a part of our input to the land rehabilitation, especially when the purpose is ecological restoration. We include monitoring the supply of ecosystem services in addition to monitoring, I would say, traditional biodiversity parameters. And like in a PTCA approach, we need to evaluate and make appropriate amendments if needed. And in one particular mine in Brazilian Amazon's lake here in this paper, we found some difference between what they had at that moment as land rehabilitation plan and the gaps that existed if we look at these through ecosystem services. They need to update, they updated their plan because they needed to, and now they also have an eye on ecosystem services. Well, I will make some brief summary of what we have been discussing. So the idea of nature positive means halting and reversing nature laws. Meeting the targets of the global biodiversity framework requires strong commitment from mining. We start to see those commitments now. So mining industry is engaging with nature positive goals. Meeting those goals requires working along the life cycle of a mine. So we really need to start looking at that when we plan for new mines. But of course, we cannot apply that only for mines that we open in the future. We need to adapt it to existing and operating mines. Offsets are often necessary and will be part of any nature positive action plan. Important to consider that mining can impact biodiversity values well beyond its footprint, both directly and indirectly. And restoring a mine site continues to be important and will remain as an important part, but probably will be insufficient to ensure nature positive outcomes. Possibly in many cases, not necessarily all, but in many cases, mining companies will need to consider anticipating conservation actions before they open a mine. That's not trivial for a mining company, even the uncertainties in raising funds and testing new projects. And at least a mine closure plan should provide and have strong mechanisms to guarantee long-term permanence of conservation gains. Some conclusions. Commitments to nature positive outcomes from mining companies should influence mine life cycle planning. This has implications for mine closure planning. So there are several challenges that needs to be better understood by the mining companies, though its whole idea is quite new. The commitment has 1 month has been made 1 month ago. Of course, they invested time and effort in thinking about that, but how this will unfold in the terrain, the mining companies we still don't know. If you are going to address also indirect or induced impacts, how far do we go? We will take care of, for example, restoration initiatives off-site. What are the boundaries and limits to responsibilities of mining companies and other actors? And the closure plan needs to really consider actions towards ensuring nature positive outcomes on every mining project. Some of the references I cited, I will not stop here, and my contacts here. And well, thanks very much. If you have time, you tell me. I would be glad to take more questions or to hear for additional comments.
Given that people do have commitments, but we also have the opportunity to talk with you over a cup of tea for those of us who are still here. But I just wanted to say to you that this is just so speaking to our commitments, to the work that we do at CRC Time. And it's just marvellous to see all of that work brought together in one presentation. It's been absolutely terrific. Thank you very much. And thank you again to Angus and to Jenny for making the links for us. I don't think this is the last time the CRC Time will be in contact with you. So thank you so much for your time with your presentation. Thank you for being flexible and working with us through some of our technical issues. And to those people online, thank you for your patience and thank you for staying with us. I hope you'll agree that it's been a really worthwhile use of your time. So thank you and join us for a cup of tea.
Thank you.
Are there any questions in the room? No? Oh, Andrew, sorry.
I'm Andrew Knight from the ARC Centre for Healing Country at Curtin University. I'm just noticing the First Nations sign over here. I noticed in the Nature Positive Initiative mission statement, it talked about measurable gains, but in a lot of values that Indigenous people have, at least here in Australia, are intangible. So have you had any thoughts on how we might mediate that?
That's very interesting because when you talk offsets, taken this as a predecessor of the idea of nature positive. One key issue is how do we measure loss and gains with types of metrics. And we are looking essentially at biodiversity. It's already in itself a very complex situation. In talk to ecologists, and they say you cannot reduce the ecosystems to a number of indexes or metrics. And for managing, we need indicators or indexes. Companies like and want to know what's our position in this 0 to 100 scale. And it's very hard to get to that conclusion. So metrics for biodiversity, there are several that have been developed. One of the things that have been learned in my understanding is that they need to be site specific, although you may have general recommendations. You need to look at the particularities of each local or each region or bioregion. But that always is something that you try to measure and capture in some types of numbers. And the intangible values, of course, are difficult to be put in that picture. So there should have a way of understanding or considering that even if you develop a very advanced set of sophisticated metrics, it may not be enough to capture the meaning of the impacts or the losses you had at the regional scale or local scale, and what you need to get nature positive. It's important, your comment, because we need to be attentive to it. And sometimes, especially in the corporate level, they tend to reduce to measurable targets, which are useful, but sometimes they're not enough. So important point.
I know, so while they're still going, Gillian, I can't see the question in the form. Are you able to?
Do you want me to answer it?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
thanks. Sorry, thank you.
So, Lewis, how does engagement with Indigenous people occur in Brazil in relation to nature positive? How does that interact? How does that work?
Well, that has not occurred to my knowledge, especially or particularly in the mining sector, because there has been no legal mining project in an indigenous land. There's a recent case because to understand the full picture, the way the legislation in Brazil works is different from, I would say, most of Anglo-Saxon world, where you don't have the idea of the traditional territory of the indigenous people is not applied legally. What's applied are indigenous lands that are legally delimited and they are designated as indigenous lands. And for that, you have a full process from employing anthropologists to study that area, to say exactly what are the limits of the area that should be considered today as indigenous land, and goes to a legal process that takes years to until we have an area that is formally recognized and demarcated as indigenous lands. So in those areas, you cannot currently have mine developments, although there has been some proposals to change the legislation, but it's still not there. But you have areas that have not been demarcated, but indigenous peoples consider that these are their traditional territories. And there are stages in this process. In those stages, the area is separated, that is considered for study. Then it goes through a number of phases until it gets to the final stage. And when they are in that initial stage, that's the case of a recent mining proposal in an area, also in the Amazon, where the proponent consulted with local parts of the local communities, and you need to engage in that so-called free, prior, and informed consent, because Brazil is signatory of the ILO, the International Labour Organization Convention 169, and so they took that step. And that's the issue. That's very recent. And so parts of the community understands that they are happy with the possible project proceeding in that area that's not legally demarcated, and others that don't agree. So if you don't have a clear legal framework for that, it will be very hard for the projects to proceed. In contrast, if you have other land-connected communities,
that has been mining in the surroundings of those communities, and the process is normally associated with getting a environmental approval. And you need to establish a special public consultation with that particular group of people, separated from the general public consultation that's part of the approvals project.
Another question?
Should we go? Yeah.
Right, and then we'll come to some.
Well, there's a comment of interest. In Peru, companies that wish to develop a project, mining or otherwise, are required to include all project components as indivisible in a single environmental impact assessment. Interesting. Wait, shall we open to yours? Yeah.
No, sorry, no, sorry, big one.
Hi, Renee. Hello. Renee Young, I'm from Aussie. You might be heading there in a few slides, but I was just wondering, do you see the role of natural capital accounting playing into determining when we're reaching nature positive, and beyond that, reporting through TNFD disclosures? Is that going to be the pathway forward for mining companies to report on what they're achieving?
That's again a very interesting point, and to my understanding, still a controversial one. And I particularly am not very familiar with all the details of TNFD. I have scheduled one student soon to have her explaining to me what she learned about the amount of documents they produced. But my limited understanding, they are looking at TNFD at having corporate level and more general indicators of their footprint and activities and gains resulting from the core activity and the value chain. And here we need to look at the specifics of the local of the place where the mining is operation and its region. So I see that more or less as those GRI indicators and report, where companies report globally, but locally the situation could be very different from the average they report on the 10 or 12 or 20 sites where they operate. So I really think that having a full understanding of the impacts at the local level, the mitigation that's necessary for those impacts, for all the full array of impacts arising from the mining, both direct and indirect, and having monitoring in place that is consistent with those impacts so that you can keep track of your actual impacts and the actual effectiveness of the mitigation you have been implementing, including offsetting.
Any other questions online?
There is one online. I'm not sure if
It does not show.
or anyone in the room, who in Australia is leading on this issue? Now, this is a huge question, I suppose.
With Australia.
Who in Australia is leading on this issue? That we want to throw out.
Oh, I can't tell you. I know that there is many.
Just on this issue. Perhaps Moira may want to give a bit more information, but I'm assuming so. Anyone got any ideas?
If it's nature positive, the Commonwealth's been speaking throughout the states and territories and trying to get contacts and try to work together with the states to develop regional planning and future actions.
Yeah, well, good to know. I heard about this Commonwealth initiative, but I'm not familiar with that. Don't need the details.